I gotta say. When I hear the word fisting, like Barry White and romance aren't exactly the first things that pop into my head, you know?
Yeah, it's definitely one of those topics that can raise some eyebrows. I think for a lot of people, it's just that initial unfamiliarity, maybe a little bit of fear of the unknown.
And that's kind of what we're tackling head on today, right? We're diving deep into fisting.txt, this guide that's all about, well, fisting. And they get right to it, addressing the biggest misconception that it's all about pain.
Right, and that's where a lot of the apprehension stems from. But the reality is when it's done safely and consensually, fisting is meant to be incredibly pleasurable. Kind of pushes the boundaries of what we typically think about when it comes to sex and sensation.
Well, they even say something like, get ready to turn your partner into a hand puppet. And okay, maybe a little awkward, but I get the idea. It's about pushing those boundaries. And speaking of intense, Jiz Lee, who's big in the BDSM and kink world, she's talked about how the orgasms from fisting are some of the most powerful she's experienced.
Yeah, and that makes sense from a purely physiological standpoint. You're stimulating multiple pleasure centers at once, leading to like this flood of endorphins, oxytocin, all those feel-good hormones we usually connect with intimacy and bonding.
So wait, it's not just a physical thing, there's an emotional component to this too.
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. The level of trust, the communication you need for fisting, it's a whole other level. You have to be vulnerable, surrender to the experience, and that can really deepen the intimacy. And let's be real, for some people, the taboo nature of it, that's a turn on in itself.
I can see that. It's like you're stepping outside of societal norms,
Yeah.
exploring this totally different side of intimacy that needs like total trust and understanding.
Right. And it's interesting, fisting isn't new. Like, there's evidence of it in different cultures, different historical periods, which I think shows how sexuality has always been about exploration and fluidity.
It's true. We tend to put things in boxes, think of them as new or whatever, but humans have been, exploring their sexuality in all sorts of ways for centuries. It speaks to this like timeless curiosity about pleasure in our bodies. But let's get into the nitty-gritty here, the practical side. The source, they're pretty blunt about it, asking, ready to get stuffed like a turkey.
A little crass, maybe, but I think it gets the point across that preparation is key. This isn't something you just like jump into blindly. It needs thought, communication with your partner. Yeah, communication is huge here. It's about making sure you're both on the same page, comfortable, and that usual chat about boundaries, what you're into, any concerns, all of that.
Consent, 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 right. It's not a one and done. It's got to be ongoing. And of course, knowing your partner's STI status, that goes without saying before things get physical.
Absolutely. Safety first, always. And on that note, our source is big on hygiene, which makes sense. We're talking squeaky clean hands, using a barrier like latex gloves or nitrile gloves. It might seem a little clinical, but it's about protecting yourself and your partner.
And this is where things get slippery. Literally. The
Right.
source actually tells this pretty funny story about a sticky situation that might make you rethink those expensive sheets.
Right. It's a funny anecdote, but it proves a point. Lube is non-negotiable. And I mean a lot of it, not just a little dab.
Huh.
The vagina, it is incredibly elastic, think like childbirth. But it still needs help to, comfortably accommodate a hand.
Wow, our bodies are wild. Speaking of wild, did you ever think we'd be talking about the medical role play aspect of gloves in the context of fisting?
It's definitely not what you expect. But, I mean, beyond the visual gloves, they do offer that extra layer of protection against STIs, right? Plus, it can just make things smoother, literally, for both partners. Less friction, more glide.
And speaking of smoothing things out, the source emphasizes going slow. Like, it's about arousal, communication throughout, easing in, finger by finger, eventually making what they call a duckbill shape with the hand.
It's a journey, not a race,
Yeah.
right? They really hammer home going slow, paying attention to your partner, and they even say, it's okay if it doesn't happen, consent and comfort over everything. Not everybody reacts the same way, and that's totally fine.
And they talk about how once the hand is inside, there are different ways to, well, navigate, whether it's angling for the G-spot, which for anyone listening who doesn't know, that's that area on the front wall of the vagina, super sensitive, or like gently stroking the cervix, or even just holding still while your partner moves. It's about finding what feels good.
Exactly. And that's where that constant communication comes in. Everyone experiences pleasure differently, right? What feels amazing for one person might not do it for another. It's about finding that sweet spot, no pun intended, through being open and honest with each other.
Right, and they're very clear. Exiting gradually is just as important as entering gradually. No sudden movements.
Exactly. You got to respect your partner's body the whole time, make sure they're comfortable.
Which brings us to a whole other side of fisting. Ready to venture into the back door, so to speak. Okay, so we've talked about vaginal fisting, but the source also gets into anal fisting, again, emphasizing safety and prep, but with the caveat that it's like a whole other level, requires experience, careful consideration. They even call it advanced, right?
Yeah, for sure. Anal fisting is not for beginners. It's not something you just jump into without the right knowledge and understanding. It needs even more trust, communication, just because of, how different our anatomies are down there.
And when you say anatomical differences, the source does not shy away from, well, the whole poop factor when it comes to anal fisting. They're pretty upfront about bowel movements, which I've got to say, I am curious about.
Yeah, it's definitely something to consider. They recommend like making sure you've had a bowel movement a few hours beforehand just to minimize any surprises. They even mention douching, but they're clear that it's a personal choice, not a necessity.
I appreciate that. Just acknowledging the reality of our bodies, not making it weird or shameful. We're all adults here.
Exactly. And actually, this is another area where those gloves are super important, not just hygiene, but also reducing the risk of STIs, which, let's be real, is higher with anal just because of the potential for tearing.
Right. They're serious about protection, which makes sense. It's about being responsible when you're exploring like this.
Absolutely. And with anal, lube is even more important. I mean, unlike the vagina, the anus doesn't self-lubricate. So they specifically recommend silicone-based lubes or oil-based.
Hold on. Didn't they say something about oil-based lubes and latex gloves not mixing? Like, that seems like a recipe for a bad time.
You're totally right. Oil can break down latex, so if you're using an oil-based lube, got to go with the nitrile gloves instead. It's these little details that make a big difference in terms of like safety and comfort.
It's like sex ed meets chemistry class.
Yeah.
So we've got our gloves, we've got our lube, we've taken care of business, so to speak. What's next on the fisting checklist?
Warming up. And I don't just mean setting the mood, although that's important too. They really stress physically prepping the anus for penetration.
Okay, so how does one warm up for something like this? Asking for a friend.
Well, it can involve things like remming, maybe using a vibrator, or even like gradually stretching with butt plugs. Think of it as easing those muscles in, getting them ready for something more intense.
Butt plugs. Training wheels for fisting. Gotta admit, that's a new one for me. But let's say we're all warmed up, ready to go. Is the actual technique similar to vaginal fisting?
The basics are similar, yeah. Gradual entry, that duck bill hand position we talked about, constant communication. But with anal, slow and steady wins the race, even more so than with vaginal. They even use the phrase like wrist deep to give you an idea of the potential depth. But they're clear, it's not about how far you go, it's about what feels good.
So it's all about listening to your body, listening to your
Yeah,
partner.
exactly. And they talk about this idea of like feeling it,
Yeah.
to know things are moving in the right direction. It's about finding that rhythm and flow that works for both of you.
And if it starts feeling good, you stop, full stop.
100%. Consent is key, always. You can pause, readjust, stop completely, whatever you need. There's no pressure to hit some specific goal.
So let's say everything is feeling good. We get to the grand finale, the exit strategy. Do we just like reverse and retreat?
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Just like with entering, you want to keep it gradual, controlled. They talk about reversing the duckbill, slowly withdrawing the hand, all while staying in tune with your partner. It's about maintaining that care and attention throughout the entire experience.
And then I'm guessing lots of aftercare, cuddles, connection, maybe a celebratory pizza.
You're not wrong. They don't mention pizza specifically, but they do emphasize aftercare. Cuddling, hydration, snacks, all of that. It's about taking that time to reconnect emotionally, physically, after something so intimate. It shows your partner you care, reinforces that trust you've built.
It really sounds like fisting, whether it's vaginal or anal. It's about so much more than just the physical act itself. It's communication, trust, exploring your boundaries, and yeah, experiencing pleasure in a whole new way.
It challenges how we think about sex, about intimacy. And it's not for everyone, but for those who are open to it, it can be incredibly powerful, incredibly fulfilling.
Totally. And I think the takeaway for everyone listening, no matter your stance on fisting, is that it's okay to be curious about sexuality, to approach it with respect and open mind. Pleasure can look like a lot of different things, and what really matters is finding what feels good and safe for you and your partner.
Couldn't have said it better myself. There's always more to learn, more to explore, both within ourselves and with a partner. And sometimes those unexpected journeys, those are the ones that lead to the most amazing discoveries.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of fisting, we encourage you to think about your own preconceptions, keep exploring the amazing spectrum of human sexuality. Thanks for joining us.